Flight 96 to Berlin.
Okay,
Newark Airport.
here we go. We're on our way to Europe.
We've got about
My wife,
3 or 4 hour wait.
Aunt Jeannie at the airport.
Through security.
And then we're going to tell a story of
That one's
the
going.
rise and fall of the Third Reich, and we're going to let this, the video play on the screen, but the audio is going to be from the audio book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, what I figure to be an important chapter, and we're going to see where it takes us. That'll be playing on the screen, and we're going to go from there. Here we go.
This is Audible. Blackstone Audio presents The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany, by William L. Shirer.
There are 16 states.
Undesirable elements, above all the Jews, but also many
and the largest city with 3.4
of them among the Slavs might be needed to toil in the fields and the mines as slaves of their German masters. Not only were the great cities of the East, Moscow, Leningrad, and Warsaw, to be permanently erased, but the culture of the Russians and Poles and other Slavs was to be stamped out and formal education denied them. As early as September 18th, 1941, Hitler had specifically ordered that Leningrad was to be wiped off the face of the earth. After being surrounded, it was to be razed to the ground by bombardment and bombing, and its population, 3 millions, was to be destroyed with it. Their thriving industries were to be dismantled and shipped to Germany, and the people themselves confined to the pursuits of agriculture so that they could grow food for Germans, being allowed to keep for themselves just enough to subsist on. Europe itself, as the Nazi leaders put it, must be made Jew-free. What happens to a Russian, to a Czech, does not interest me in the slightest, declared Heinrich Himmler on October 4th, 1943, in a confidential address to his SS officers at Posen. By this time, Himmler, as chief of the SS and the entire police apparatus of the Third Reich, was next to Hitler in importance, holding the power of life and death not only over 80 million Germans, but over twice that many conquered people. What the nations, Himmler continued, can offer in the way of good blood of our type we will take, if necessary by kidnapping their children and raising them here with us. Whether nations live in prosperity or starve to death like cattle interests me only insofar as we need them as slaves to our Kultur. Otherwise, it is of no interest to me. Whether 10,000 Russian females fall down from exhaustion while digging an anti-tank ditch interests me only insofar as the anti-tank ditch for Germany is finished. Long before Himmler's Posen speech in 1943, to which we shall return for it covers other aspects of the new order, the Nazi chiefs had laid down their thoughts and plans for enslaving the people of the East. By October 15th, 1940, Hitler had decided on the future of the Czechs, the first Slavic people he had conquered. One half of them were to be assimilated, mostly by shipping them as slave labor to Germany. The other half, particularly the intellectuals, were simply to be, in the words of a secret report on the subject, eliminated. A fortnight before, on October 2nd, the Fuhrer had clarified his thoughts about the fate of the Poles, the second of the Slavic peoples to be conquered. His faithful secretary, Martin Bormann, has left a long memorandum on the Nazi plans, which Hitler outlined to Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Rump, Poland, and to other officials. The Poles, Hitler emphasized, are especially born for low labor. There can be no question of improvement for them. It is necessary to keep the standard of life low in Poland, and it must not be permitted to rise. The Poles are lazy, and it is necessary to use compulsion to make them work. The Government General of Poland should be used by us merely as a source of unskilled labor. Every year, the laborers needed by the Reich could be procured from there. As for the Polish priests, they will preach what we want them to preach. If any priest acts differently, we shall make short work of him. The task of the priest is to keep the Poles quiet, stupid, and dull-witted. There were 2 other classes of Poles to be dealt with, and the Nazi dictator did not neglect mention of them. It is indispensable to bear in mind that the Polish gentry must cease to exist. However cruel this may sound, they must be exterminated wherever they are. There should be one master only for the Poles, the German. Two masters, side by side, cannot and must not exist. Therefore, all representatives of the Polish intelligentsia are to be exterminated. This sounds cruel, but such is the law of life. This obsession of the Germans with the idea that they were the master race and that the Slavic peoples must be their slaves was especially virulent in regard to Russia. Erich Koch, the roughneck Reich Commissar for the Ukraine, expressed it in a speech at Kiev on March 5, 1943. We are the master race and must govern hard but just. I will draw the very last out of this country. I did not come to spread bliss. The population must work, work, and work again. We definitely did not come here to give out manna. We have come here to create the basis for victory. We are a master race which must remember that the lowliest German worker is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable than the population here. Nearly a year before, on July 23, 1942, when the German armies in Russia were nearing the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus, Martin Bormann, Hitler's party secretary and by now right-hand man, wrote a long letter to Rosenberg reiterating the Führer's views on the subject. The letter was summed up by an official in Rosenberg's ministry. The Slavs are to work for us. Insofar as we don't need them, they may die. Therefore, compulsory vaccination and German health services are superfluous. The fertility of the Slavs is undesirable. They may use contraceptives or practice abortion. The more the better. Education is dangerous. It is enough if they can count up to 100. Every educated person is a future enemy. Religion we leave to them as a means of diversion. As for food, they won't get any more than is absolutely necessary. We are the masters. We come first. When the German troops first entered Russia, they were in many places hailed as liberators by a population long ground down and terrorized by Stalin's tyranny. There were in the beginning wholesale desertions among the Russian soldiers, especially in the Baltic, which had been under Soviet occupation but a short time, and in the Ukraine, where an incipient independence movement had never been quite stamped out. Many were happy to be freed from the Soviet yoke, even by the Germans. There were a few in Berlin who believed that if Hitler played his cards shrewdly, treating the population with consideration and promising relief from Bolshevik practices, by granting religious and economic freedom and making true cooperatives out of the collectivized farms, and eventual self-government, the Russian people could be won over. They might then not only cooperate with the Germans in the occupied regions, but in the unoccupied ones strive for liberation from Stalin's harsh rule. If this were done, it was argued, the Bolshevik regime itself might collapse and the Red Army disintegrate, as the Tsarist armies had done in 1917. But the savagery of the Nazi occupation and the obvious aims of the German conquerors, often publicly proclaimed to plunder the Russian lands, enslave their peoples and colonize the East with Germans, soon destroyed any possibility of such a development. No one summed up this disastrous policy and all the opportunities it destroyed better than a German himself. Dr. Otto Bräutigam, a career diplomat and the deputy leader of the political department of Rosenberg's newly created Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories. In a bitter confidential report to his superiors on October 25, 1942, Bräutigam dared to pinpoint the Nazi mistakes in Russia. In the Soviet Union, we found on our arrival a population weary of Bolshevism, which waited longingly for new slogans holding out the prospect of a better future for them. It was Germany's duty to find such slogans, but they remained unuttered. The population greeted us with joy as liberators and placed themselves at our disposal. Actually, there was a slogan, but the Russian people soon saw through it. With the inherent instinct of the Eastern peoples, Bräutigam continued, the primitive man soon found out that for Germany the slogan, liberation from Bolshevism, was only a pretext to enslave the Eastern peoples according to her own methods. The worker and peasant soon perceived that Germany did not regard them as partners of equal rights, but considered them only as the objective of her political and economic aims. With unequaled presumption, we put aside all political knowledge and treat the peoples of the occupied Eastern Territories as second-class whites, to whom Providence has merely assigned the task of serving as slaves for Germany. There were two other developments, Bräutigam declared, which had turned the Russians against the Germans. the barbaric treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, and the shanghaiing of Russian men and women for slave labor. It is no longer a secret from friend or foe that hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war have died of hunger or cold in our camps. We now experience the grotesque picture of having to recruit millions of laborers from the occupied eastern territories after prisoners of war have died of hunger like flies. In the prevailing limitless abuse of the Slavic humanity, recruiting methods were used which probably have their origin only in the blackest periods of the slave traffic. A regular manhunt was inaugurated. Without consideration of health or age, the people were shipped to Germany. Neither the extermination of masses of Soviet prisoners of war nor the exploitation of Russian slave labor was a secret to the Kremlin. As early as November 1941, Molotov had made a formal diplomatic protest against the extermination of Russian POWs. And in April of the following year, he made another protest against the German slave labor program. German policy and practice in Russia had brought about the enormous resistance of the Eastern peoples, this official concluded. Our policy has forced both Bolshevists and Russian nationalists into a common front against us. The Russian fights today with exceptional bravery and self-sacrifice for nothing more or less than recognition of his human dignity. Closing his 13-page memorandum on a positive note, Dr. Breutigam asked for a complete change of policy. The Russian people, he argued, must be told something concrete about their future. But this was a voice in the Nazi wilderness. Hitler, as we have seen, already had laid down, before the attack began, his directives on what would be done with Russia and the Russians, and he was not a man who could be persuaded by any living German to change them by one iota. On July 16, 1941, less than a month after the commencement of the Russian campaign, but when it was already evident from the initial German successes that a large slice of the Soviet Union would soon be within grasp, Hitler convoked Goering, Keitel, Rosenberg, Bormann, and Lammers, the last head of the Reich Chancellery, to his headquarters in East Prussia to remind them of his aims in the newly conquered land. At last, his goal, so clearly stated in Mein Kampf, of securing a vast German Lebensraum in Russia, was in sight, and it is clear from the confidential memorandum of the meeting drawn up by Bormann, which showed up at Nuremberg, that he wanted his chief lieutenants to understand well what he intended to do with it. His intentions, he admonished, must, however, not be publicized. There is no need for that,
No,
said,
keep
but
it
the main
secret.
thing is that we ourselves know what we want. Nobody must be able to recognize that it initiates a final settlement.
We're going to take over.
This need not prevent our taking all necessary measures, shooting, resettling, etc., and we shall take them. In principle, Hitler continued, we now have to face the task of cutting up the cake according to our needs in order to be able, first, to dominate it, second, to administer it, third, to exploit it. He did not mind, he said, that the Russians had ordered partisan warfare behind the German lines. It enables us to eradicate everyone who opposes us. In general, Hitler explained, Germany would dominate the Russian territory up to the Urals. None but Germans would be permitted to carry weapons in that vast space. Then Hitler went over specifically what would be done with various slices of the Russian cake. The entire Baltic country will have to be incorporated into Germany. The Crimea has to be evacuated by all foreigners and settled by Germans only, becoming Reich territory. The Kola Peninsula will be taken by Germany because of the large nickel mines there. The annexation of Finland as a federated state should be prepared with caution. The Fuhrer will raze Leningrad to the ground and then
Finland
hand it
has
over
oil.
to the Finns.
They're all doing well.
Fields, Hitler ordered, would become a German concession, and the German colonies on the Volga would be annexed outright. When it came to a discussion as to which Nazi leaders would administer the new territory, a violent quarrel broke out. Rosenberg states he intends to use Captain von Petersdorf, owing to his special merits, general consternation, general rejections. The Fuhrer and the Reich Marshal, Goering, both emphasized that there was no doubt that von Petersdorf was insane. There was also an argument on the best methods of policing the conquered Russian people. Hitler suggested the German police be equipped with armored cars. Goering doubted that they would be necessary. His planes could drop bombs in case of riots, he said. Naturally, Goering added, this giant area would have to be pacified as quickly as possible. The best solution would be to shoot anybody who looked sideways.
That's a good solution.
It will be remembered, Goering had told Chano that this year between 20 and 30 million persons will die of hunger in Russia, and that perhaps it is well that it should be so. Already, he said, Russian prisoners of war had begun to eat each other.
Get rid of
Goering,
them.
as head of the 4-year plan, was also put in charge of the economic
Did he
exploitation
say
of Russia.
eat each other?
In a directive of Goering's economic staff east on May 23, 1941, the destruction of the Russian industrial areas was ordered. The workers and their families in these regions were to be left to starve. Any attempt to save the population there, the directive stated, from death by starvation by importing food surpluses from the black soil zone of Russia was prohibited. Plunder would be a better word, as Goering made clear in a
That's
speech
it,
to the
plunder.
Nazi commissioners for the occupied territories on August 6, 1942. It used to be called plundering, he said, but today things have become more humane. In spite of that, I intend to plunder and to do it thoroughly. On this, at
And he
least,
did.
he was as good as his word, not only in Russia, but throughout Nazi-conquered Europe. It was all part of the new order. The Nazi plunder of Europe. The total amount of loot will never be known. It has proved beyond man's capacity to accurately compute. But some figures are available, many of them from the Germans themselves. They show with what Germanic thoroughness the instructions which Goering once gave to his subordinates were carried out. Whenever you come across anything that may be needed by the German people, you must be after it like a bloodhound. It must be taken out and brought to Germany.
And
A great
given to
deal
him.
was taken out,
He'll
not only
wind
in
up with
goods
it.
and services, but in banknotes and gold. Whenever Hitler occupied a country, his financial agents seized the gold and foreign holdings of its national bank. That was a mere beginning.
Now here I'm going to keep
Occupation
recording
costs
and all.
were immediately assessed.
Uh,
By the end of February
and then I'll
1944, Count
edit
Schwerin
it
von Grüssing,
and take what I
the
want
Nazi
out of
Minister
it.
of Finance, put the total take
Because
from
there's
such
some
payments at
parts,
some
and this would be
48
the
billion
easiest method
marks,
for me. There's some, but this is
roughly
all
$12
boring
billion,
here about.
of which France, which
the
was
billions
heavier
that they
than any
plundered.
other conquered country,
But that's
furnished
my
more than
intent to go
half.
through the whole
By the
thing
end
and
of the
bring
war,
it back
receipts from
and
occupation
edit it.
assessments amounted to an
Edit
estimated
out
60
so we
billion
catch the
marks,
parts that
$15 billion.
I
France was
think
forced to
are
pay
important
31.5
to
billion
me,
of this
to
total.
us.
Its annual contributions of more than 7 billions, coming to over 4 times the yearly sums which Germany had paid in reparations under the Dawes and Young plans after the First War, a tribute which had seemed such a heinous crime to Hitler. In addition, the Bank of France was forced to grant credits to Germany totaling 4.5 billion marks, and the French government to pay a further $500 million in fines. At Nuremberg, it was estimated that the Germans extracted in occupation costs and credits 2/3 of Belgium's national income and a similar percentage from the Netherlands. Altogether, according to a study by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Germany extracted in tribute from the conquered nations a total of 104 billion marks, $26 billion. At the official rate of exchange, 2.5 Reichsmarks to the dollar, this would amount to $40 billion. But I have used the unofficial rate of 4 Reichsmarks to the dollar. In terms of purchasing power, it is more accurate. But the goods seized and transported to the Reich without even the formality of payment can never possibly be estimated. Figures kept pouring in at Nuremberg until they overwhelmed one. But no expert, so far as I know, was ever able to straighten them out and compute totals. In France, for example, it was estimated that the Germans carted off, as levies in kind, 9 million tons of cereals, 75% of the total production of oats, 80% of oil, 74% of steel, and so on, for a grand total of 184.5 billion francs. Russia, devastated by warfare and German savagery, proved harder to milk. Nazi documents are full of reports of Soviet deliveries. In 1943, for example, 9 million tons of cereals, 2 million tons of fodder, 3 million tons of potatoes, 662,000 tons of meat were listed by the Germans among the deliveries to which the Soviet Committee of Investigation added, for the duration of the occupation, 9 million cattle, 12 million pigs, 13 million sheep, to mention a few items. But Russian deliveries proved much less than expected. The Germans calculated them as worth a net of only some 4 billion marks, $1 billion. According to Alexander Dahlen in his exhaustive study of German rule in Russia, Germany could have obtained more from Russia in normal trade. See Dahlen, German rule in Russia. Everything possible was squeezed out of Poland by the greedy Nazi conquerors. I shall endeavor, said Dr. Frank, the Governor General, to squeeze out of this province everything that is still possible to squeeze out. This was at the end of 1942.
The poor
In the 3
Poles,
years
their
since the
country was
occupation, he had already
in
squeezed
lies
out, as he continually
between
boasted, a great
Germany
deal,
and Russia.
especially in foodstuffs for hungry
They've been
Germans in the
overrun
Reich. He warned, however,
many
that
times.
if the new food scheme is carried out in 1943, 500,000 people in Warsaw and its suburbs alone will be deprived of food. The nature of the new order in Poland had been laid down as soon as the country was conquered. On October 3, 1939, Frank informed the army of Hitler's orders. Poland can only be administered by utilizing the country through means of ruthless exploitation, deportation of all supplies, raw materials, machines, factory installations, etc., which are important for the German war economy, availability of all workers for work within Germany, reduction of the entire Polish economy to absolute minimum necessary for bare existence of the population, closing of all educational institutions, especially technical schools and colleges, in order to prevent the growth of the new Polish intelligentsia. Poland shall be treated as a colony.
Keep everyone
Poles
dumb.
shall be the slaves of the Greater German Reich. Rudolf Hess, the Nazi deputy Führer, added that Hitler had decided that Warsaw shall not be rebuilt, nor is it the intention of the Führer to rebuild or reconstruct any industry in the government general. By decree of Dr. Frank, all property in Poland belonging not only to Jews but to Poles was subject to confiscation without compensation. Hundreds of thousands of Polish-owned farms were simply grabbed and handed over to German settlers. By May 31st, 1943, in the 4 Polish districts annexed to Germany, West Prussia, Posen, Zichenau, Silesia, some 700,000 estates comprising 15 million acres were seized, and 9,500 estates totaling 6.5 million acres confiscated. The difference between seizure and confiscation is not explained in the elaborate table prepared by the German Central
There is no
State
difference.
and to the dispossessed Poles it must not have mattered. Even the art treasures in the occupied lands were looted, and as the captured Nazi documents later revealed, on the express orders of Hitler and Goering, who thereby greatly augmented their private collections. The corpulent Reich Marshal, according to his own estimate,
That
brought
fat
his own
bastard.
collection up to a value of 50 million Reichsmarks. Indeed, Goering was the driving force in this particular field of looting. Immediately upon the conquest of Poland, he issued orders for the seizure of art treasures there, and within 6 months, the special commissioner appointed to carry out his command could report that he had taken over almost the entire art treasury of the country. But it was in France where
And
the
even
bulk
at
of the
the
great art treasures of Europe
at the end
lay.
for Goering,
No sooner was this
he had a
country added to the
cyanide
Nazi
pill,
conquests than Hitler and Goering decreed
and
their seizure.
he swallowed the
To carry
damn
out this
cyanide
particular
pill while he was
blunder,
under
Hitler
guard.
appointed Rosenberg, who set up an organization called Einsatzstab Rosenberg, and who was assisted not only by
Died an
Goering,
easy
but by
death, I
General
guess
Keitel.
you'd have to say.
Indeed, one order by Keitel to the army in France stated that Rosenberg is entitled to transport to Germany cultural goods which appear valuable to him and to safeguard them there. The Führer has reserved for himself the decision as to their use. An idea of Hitler's decision as to their use is revealed in a secret order issued by Goering on November 5, 1940, specifying the distribution of art objects being collected at the Louvre in Paris. They were to be disposed of in the following way. 1. Those art objects about which the Führer has reserved for himself the decision as to their use. 2. Those which serve
Some
the
will go to
completion of the
Hitler,
Reich Marshals,
and the Reich
i.e.
Marshal, he'll
Goering's
take
collection.
his share.
4. Those that are suited to be sent to German museums. The French government protested the looting of the country's art treasures, declaring that it was a violation of the Hague Convention. And when one German art expert on Rosenberg's staff, a Herr Bunjes, dared to call this to the attention of Goering, the fat one replied, "My dear Bunjes, let me worry about that.
The fat
I am
bastard.
the highest jurist in the state. It is my orders which are decisive, and you will act accordingly." And So, according to a report of Bunyas, it is his only appearance in the history of the Third Reich so far as the documents show. Those art objects collected at the Jeu de Paume, which are to go into the Führer's possession, and those which the Reich Marshal claims for himself, will be loaded into 2 railroad cars which will be attached to the Reich Marshal's special train to Berlin.
Now that's what I
Many
call
more
crooks.
carloads followed. According to a secret official German report, some 137 freight cars loaded with 4,174 cases of artworks comprising 21,903 objects, including 10,890 paintings, made the journey from the west to Germany up to July 1944.
My wife and my one son were apprehended to took caps and put caps in his pocket in one of the stores.
As early as January
Comical.
1941, Rosenberg
And they got him.
the
They
artwork
caught
France
him.
alone is worth $1
Made him
billion.
cry. They let him
Plunder of
go.
raw materials, manufactured goods, and food, though it reduced the occupied peoples to impoverishment, hunger, and sometimes starvation, and violated the Hague Convention on the Conduct of War, might have been excused, if not justified, by the Germans as necessitated by the harsh exigencies of total war. But the stealing of art treasures did not help Hitler's war machine. It was a case merely of avarice, the personal greed of Hitler and Goering. All this plunder and spoliation the conquered populations could have endured. Wars and enemy occupation had always brought privation in their wake. But this was only a part
Darn
of the new order, the mildest part.
Thinking about that,
Not of material goods,
maybe that's
but of
part of
human
the
lives.
reason I'm a half German too. Jesus, that's what was wrong with me. Part of what was wrong with me.
Seldom experienced by man in all his time on earth. Millions of decent, innocent men
Max
and women
Million.
driven into forced labor. Millions more tortured and
And wait till you
tormented
get to
in
the part
concentration
where,
camps. And millions more still
where Max
who
come
lived
from.
4.5
Max
million
Million, my
Jews alone,
great.
massacred in cold blood or
Baden,
deliberately starved to
I'll
death.
point it out
Their remains, in order to remove the traces,
later.
burned. This incredible story of horror would be unbelievable were it not fully documented and testified to by the perpetrators themselves. What follows here, a mere summary which must, because of limitations of space, leave out 1,000 shocking details, is based on that incontrovertible evidence, with occasional corroboration from the eyewitness accounts of the few survivors. Slave labor in the New Order. By the end of September 1944, some 7.5 million civilian foreigners were toiling for the Third Reich. Nearly all of them had been rounded up by force, deported to Germany in boxcars, usually without food or water or any sanitary facilities, and there put to work.
Uncle
in the
Steve
factories,
wound up in a
fields, and
boxcar.
mines. They were not only put to work, but
Captured in the
beaten and starved,
Battle
and
of the
often left to
Bulge.
die for lack of food, clothing, and shelter. In addition, 2 million prisoners of war were added to the foreign labor force, at least 500,000 of whom were made to work in the armaments and munitions industries, in flagrant violation of the Hague
No wonder he
Convention,
drank.
which stipulated that no war prisoners could be
Until
employed
his
in such
death.
tasks. Albert
Poor
Speer,
guy.
Minister for Armament and War Production, admitted at Nuremberg that 40% of all prisoners of war were employed in 1944.
That's right, I'm half Polish too.
Production of weapons and munitions,
Uh-huh.
and in subsidiary industries.
Where the drink
This
it come
figure
from?
did not include the hundreds of thousands of other POWs who were imprisoned
Bad
in building
combination.
fortifications,
Phew, man.
carrying ammunition to the front lines, and even in manning anti-aircraft guns, in further disregard of the international conventions which Germany had signed. A captured record shows Field Marshal Milch of the Air Force in 1943 demanding 50,000 more Russian war prisoners to be added to the 30,000 already manning anti-aircraft artillery. It is amusing, Milch laughed, that Russians must work the guns. In the massive deportations of slave labor to the Reich, wives were torn away from their husbands, and children from their parents,
Oh, that's
and
okay.
assigned to widely separated parts of Germany. The young, if they were old enough to work at all, were not spared. Even top generals of the army cooperated in the kidnapping of children, who were carted off to the homeland to perform slave labor.
That's all right.
A memorandum from Rosenberg's files of June 12, 1944, reveals this practice in occupied Russia. Army Group Center intends
That
to
Hitler
apprehend
was a
40 to 50,000 youths from the age
damn,
of 10 to 14
goddamn madman.
and transport them to the Reich. The measure was originally proposed by the Ninth Army.
Thank
It is
God
intended
that
to allot
that
these
generation
juveniles primarily to the German trades as apprentices. This action has
fought
been greatly welcomed by the German trade since it represents a
beat
decisive
'em.
measure for the alleviation of the shortage of apprentices. This action is not only aimed at preventing a direct reinforcement of the enemy's strength,
and
but
having,
also as a
after
reduction of
having
its
done so,
biological
when we went in
potentiality.
a few years later,
The kidnapping operation
I
had
was
code
taught.
Hay action. It was also being carried out, the memorandum added, by Field Marshal Model's Army Group Ukraine North.
How to win. They know they were taught how to
was
win
used to
too.
round up the victims.
We better
First,
teach.
comparatively mild methods were used. Persons coming out of church or the movies were nabbed. In the West especially, SS units merely blocked off a section of a town and seized all able-bodied men and women. Villages were surrounded and searched for the same purposes. In the East, when there was resistance to the forced labor order, villages were simply burned down and their inhabitants carted off. Rosenberg's captured files are replete with German reports of such happenings. In Poland, at least one German official thought things were going a little too far. The wild and ruthless manhunt, he wrote to Governor Frank, has exercised everywhere in towns and countries, in streets, squares, stations, even in churches, at night in homes, has badly shaken the feeling of security of the inhabitants. Everybody is exposed to the danger of being seized anywhere and at any time by the police, suddenly and unexpectedly, and of being sent to an assembly
Geez,
camp.
at least our
None of
cops,
his
they
relatives knows what has
hang out in Dunkin' Donuts. They
Rounding
just
up
want
the
their
slave
pay,
workers
that's
was
all.
only the first
As long as
step.
you pay them, let them go to Dunkin'
The
Donuts
entire slave labor program was put in charge
and
of
wear
Prince
sunglasses.
Zalko, who was given the title of plenipotentiary
Have a nice
general for
day.
the allocation of labor. A second-string Nazi, he had been Gauleiter and governor of Thuringia. A pig-eyed little
Jackie
man,
Gleason
rude
played
and
that
tough.
role
He
perfect
was,
when he
as
came out with
Goebbels
that
mentioned
toilet
in his
paper
diary,
hanging
one of the dullest
out of
the
his back
dull.
pocket.
In the dock at Nuremberg, he struck this writer as being a complete non-entity, the sort of German who in other times might have been a butcher in a small-town meat market. One of his first directives laid it down that the
This is
foreign
the
workers
guy.
were to be treated in such a way as to
This is the
exploit them to the
guy.
highest possible extent at the lowest conceivable degree of expenditure. He admitted at Nuremberg that of all the millions of foreign workers, not even 200,000 came voluntarily. However, at the trial, he denied all responsibility for their ill treatment.
On my
He was
second
found
trip
guilty,
to
sentenced to death, and hanged
Auschwitz,
in the Nuremberg jail
this
on the
trip
night of
with
October
Jeannie,
15th to 16th, 1946.
I stood where
condition
they
of their
hung the
transport to
bastard.
Germany left something to be desired. A certain
The head of the
Dr.
camp,
Bootkelk
the Auschwitz
described
camp.
one instance in a report to Rosenberg's ministry on September 30th, 1942. Recounting how a train packed with returning, worked-out Eastern laborers met a train at a siding near Brest-Litovsk full of newly recruited Russian workers bound for Germany, he wrote, "Because of the corpses in the trainload of returning laborers, a catastrophe might have occurred. In this train, women gave birth to babies who were thrown out of the windows during the journey. Persons having tuberculosis and venereal diseases rode in the same car. Dying people lay in freight cars without straw, and one of the dead was thrown on the railway embankment. The same must have occurred in other returning transports." This was not a very promising introduction to the Third Reich for the Ostarbeiter, but at least it prepared them somewhat for the ordeal that lay ahead. Hunger lay ahead, and beatings and disease and exposure to the cold, in unheated quarters and in their thin rags. Long hours of labor lay ahead that were limited only by their ability to stand on their feet. The great Krupp Works, makers of Germany's guns and tanks and ammunition, was a typical place of employment. Krupp employed a large number of slave laborers, including Russian prisoners of war. At one point during the war, 600 Jewish women from the Buchenwald concentration camp were brought in to work at Krupp's, being housed in a bombed-out work camp from which the previous inmates, Italian POWs, had been removed. Dr. Wilhelm Jäger, the senior doctor for Krupp's slaves, described in an affidavit at Nuremberg what he found there when he took over. "Upon my first visit, I found these females suffering from open festering wounds and other diseases. I was the first doctor they had seen for at least a fortnight. There were no medical supplies. They had no shoes and went about in their bare feet. The sole clothing of each consisted of a sack with holes for their arms and head. Their hair was shorn. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and closely guarded by SS guards. The amount of food in the camp was extremely meager and of very poor quality. One could not enter the barracks without being attacked by fleas. I got large boils on my arms and the rest of my body from them. Dr. Jaeger reported the situation to the directors of Krupp, and even to the personal physician of Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the owner, but in vain. Nor did his reports on other Krupp slave labor camps bring any alleviation. He recalled in his affidavit some of these reports of conditions in 8 camps inhabited by Russian and Polish workers. Overcrowding that bred disease, lack of enough food to keep a man alive, lack of water, lack of toilets. The clothing of the Eastern workers was likewise completely inadequate. They worked and slept in the same clothing in which they had arrived from the East. Virtually all of them had no overcoats and were compelled to use their blankets as coats in cold and rainy weather. In view of the shortage of shoes, many workers were forced to go to work in their bare feet, even in winter. Sanitary conditions were atrocious. At Kramerplatz, only 10 children's toilets were available for 1,200 inhabitants.
That would be enough.
Contaminated the entire floors of these lavatories. The Tartars
We
and
had-
Kipnis suffered most.
We wanted
They
4
collapsed like flies from bad housing,
toilets in
quality and
the
insufficient
club.
quantity of food, overwork, and
Oh, we only got
insufficient
3.
rest. These workers were likewise afflicted with spotted fever. Lice, the carrier of the disease, together with countless fleas, bugs, and other vermin, tortured the inhabitants of these camps. At times, the water supply at the camps was shut off for periods of from 8 to 14 days. On the whole, Western slave workers fared better than those from the East, the latter being considered by the Germans as mere scum. But the difference was only relative, as Dr. Jaeger found at one of Krupp's work camps occupied by French prisoners of war in Nogaretstrasse at Essen. Its inhabitants were kept for nearly half a year in dog kennels, urinals, and in old baking houses. The dog kennels were 3 feet high, 9 feet long, 6 feet wide. 5 men slept in each of them. The prisoners had to crawl into these kennels on all fours. There was no water in the camp. Besides obtaining thousands of slave laborers, both civilians and prisoners of war, for its factories in Germany, the Krupp firm also built a large fuse factory at the extermination camp at Auschwitz, where Jews were worked to exhaustion and then gassed.
Auschwitz. My God.
Baron Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the chairman of the board, was indicted as a major war criminal at Nuremberg, along with Goering et al. But because of his physical and mental condition, he had had a stroke and had faded into senility, he was not tried. He died on January 16, 1950. An effort was made by the prosecution to try in his stead his son, Alfred, who had acquired sole ownership of the company in 1943, but the tribunal denied this. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was subsequently tried before a Nuremberg
can't
military
blame the
tribunal,
son.
a purely American court, along with 9 directors of the firm, in the United States versus Alfred Krupp et al. Case. On July 31st, 1948, he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment and confiscation of all
That's
his
more
property.
than enough.
He was released from Landsberg prison, where Hitler had served his sentence in 1924, on February 4th, 1951.
That's where
in a
that
general
bastard wrote
amnesty
that
issued
Mein
by John
Kampf.
J. McCloy,
Tell him
U.S. High
what.
Commissioner. Not only was the confiscation of his corporate property annulled, but his personal fortune of some $10 million was returned to him. The Allied governments had ordered the breakup of the vast Krupp empire, but Alfred Krupp, who took over the active management of the firm after his release from prison, evaded the order, and at the time of writing, 1959, announced with the approval of the Bonn government that not only would the company not be broken up, but that it was acquiring new industries. Some 2.5 million slave laborers, mostly Slavs and Italians, were assigned to farm work in Germany, and though their life from the very force of circumstances was better than that of those in the city factories, it was far from ideal, or even humane. A capture directive on the treatment of foreign farm workers of Polish nationality gives an inkling of their treatment. And though applied to Poles, it is dated March 6, 1941, before Russians became available, it was later used as guidance for those of other nationalities. Farm workers of Polish nationality no longer have the right to complain, and thus no complaints will be accepted by any official agency. The visit of churches
They're
is
not
strictly
going to
prohibited.
accept complaints.
Visits to theaters, motion pictures, or other cultural entertainment are strictly prohibited.
Not allowed.
Sexual intercourse with women and girls is strictly prohibited.
Absolutely not allowed.
If it was with German females, it was, according to an edict of Himmler in 1942, punishable
You'll
by
be
death.
shot.
Himmler's directive of February 20th, 1942 was directed especially against Russian slave workers. It ordered special treatment also for severe violations against discipline, including work refusal or loafing at work.
Absolutely no loafing.
Special treatment is requested. Special treatment is hanging. It should not take place in the immediate vicinity of the camp.
Anybody can see
A
it.
certain number, however, should attend the special
Yeah, but
treatment.
let a few of them see it.
The term special treatment
scared
was a
the shit
common
out of
one in Himmler's
everybody.
files and in Nazi parlance during the war. It meant just what Himmler in this directive said it meant. The use of railroads, buses, or other public conveyances was prohibited for slave farm workers. This apparently was ordained so that they would not escape from the farms to which they were bound. Arbitrary change of employment, the directive stated, is strictly prohibited. The farm workers have to labor as long as is demanded by the employer. There are no time limits to the working time. Every employer has the right to give corporal punishment to his farm workers. They should, if possible, be removed from the community of the home, and they can be quartered in stables, etc.
That's
No
good.
remorse
That's good
whatever
enough
should
for them.
restrict such action. Even the Slav women seized and shipped to Germany for domestic service were treated as slaves. As early as 1942, Hitler had commanded Sauckel to procure 500,000 of them in order to relieve the German housewife. The slave labor commissar laid
That's
down
what
the
I call
conditions of work in the German household.
Getting help, man. Oh man,
There is no
beautiful.
claim to free time. Female domestic workers from the East may leave the household only to take care of domestic tasks. It is prohibited for them to enter restaurants, movies, theaters, and similar
And all for
establishments.
nothing.
Attending church is also prohibited.
Absolutely
Women,
no.
it is obvious, were almost as necessary as men in the Nazi slave labor program. Of some 3 million Russian civilians pressed into service by the Germans, more than one-half were women. Most of them were assigned to do heavy farm work and to labor in the factories. The enslavement of millions of men and women of the conquered lands as lowly toilers for the Third Reich was not just a wartime measure. From the statements of Hitler, Goering, Himmler, and the others already cited, and they are only a tiny sampling, it is clear that if Nazi Germany had endured, the new order would have meant the rule of the German master race over a vast slave empire,
Europe,
stretching
all
from
of
the
Europe.
Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. To be sure, the Slavs in the East would have fared the worst. As Hitler emphasized in July 1941, scarcely a month after he had attacked the Soviet Union, his plans for its occupation constituted a final settlement. A year later, at the high tide of his Russian conquests, he admonished his aides, "As for the ridiculous 100 million Slavs, we will mold the best of them to the shape that suits us, and we will isolate the rest of them in their own pigsties. And anyone who talks about cherishing the local inhabitant and civilizing him goes straight off to a concentration camp."
Don't dare complain.
Prisoners of war. Though it was a flagrant violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions to use prisoners of
Here
war
I
in
gotta watch for
armament factories
eventually
or in
when
any
a
labor
little bit of
connected
a
with the
mention
fighting
of
at the front, such
my Uncle
employment,
Steve.
massive as it was, constituted the least of worries for the millions of soldiers captured by the Third Reich. Their overwhelming concern was to survive the war. If they were Russian, the odds were greatly against them. There were more Soviet war prisoners than all others put together, some 5.75 million of them. Of these, barely 1 million were found alive when Allied troops liberated the inmates of the POW camps in 1945. About 1 million had either been released during the war or allowed to serve in the collaborator units set up by the German army. 2 million Russian prisoners of war died in German captivity, from starvation, exposure, and disease. The remaining million have never been accounted for, and at Nuremberg a good case was made that most of them either had died from the above causes
No wonder the
or
Russians
had
had
been
to be tough.
exterminated by the SS Security Service. According to the German records, 67,000 were executed, but this is most certainly a partial figure. The bulk of the Russian war prisoners, some 3,800,000 of them, were taken by the Germans in the first phase of the Russian campaign, in the great battles
When they
of
were
encirclement,
winning.
which were fought from June 21st to December 6, 1941. Admittedly, it was difficult for an army in the midst of
And
combat
the only thing that saved them was the winter.
for such a large number of captives.
And Hitler's
But the Germans
stupidity.
made no effort to. Indeed, the Nazi records show, as we have seen, that the Soviet prisoners were deliberately starved and left out in the open without shelter to die in the terrible sub-zero snowbound winter of 1941 to 42. The more of these prisoners who die, the better it is for us.
I remember seeing
Many
pictures
Nazi
there,
officials, according to no less
like
an authority
soldiers
than
on skis and all.
the clumsy minister for the occupied
it
eastern
snows.
territories was not a humane Nazi, particularly in regard to the Russians, with whom, as we have seen, he had grown up. But even he was moved to protest
from
the treatment
Finland
of
or
Russian prisoners
something
in a
is what-
long
as I
letter to General
remember.
Keitel, the chief of OKW, dated February 28, 1942. This was the moment when the Soviet counteroffensive, which had hurled the Germans back before Moscow and Rostov, had reached its farthest penetrations that winter, and when the Germans had realized at last that their gamble of destroying Russia in one short campaign, or perhaps ever, had failed, and that just possibly, now that the USA had been added to Russia and Britain as their enemies, they might not win the
And
war,
the winter
in
did
which
it to
case
them.
they would be held accountable for their war crimes.
And then Hitler refused to let
The fate
them
of the Soviet prisoners of war in Germany, Rosenberg wrote Keitel, is a
Retreat.
tragedy of the greatest extent. Of the 3,600,000 of them,
It's
only
always
several
my
hundred
feeling.
thousand
Retreat,
are still
retreat
able to
from
work
who?
fully.
From who?
A large part of them have starved or died because of the hazards of the weather. This could have been avoided, Rosenberg continued. There was food enough in Russia to provide them. However, in the majority of cases, the camp commanders have forbidden food to be put at the disposal of the prisoners. They have rather let them starve to death. Even on the march to the camps, the civilian population was not allowed to give the prisoners food. In many cases, when the prisoners could no longer keep up on the march because of hunger and exhaustion, they were shot before the eyes of the horrified civilian population, and the corpses were left. In numerous camps, no shelter for the prisoners was provided at all. They lay under the open sky during rain or
Ruled by
snow.
fear.
Finally, the shooting of prisoners of war must be mentioned. These ignore all political understanding. For instance, in various camps, all the Asiatics were shot. Not only Asiatics. Shortly after the beginning of the Russian campaign, an agreement was reached between OKW and the SS Security Service for the latter to screen Russian prisoners. The objective was disclosed in an affidavit by Otto Ohlendorf, one of the SD's great killers, and like so many of the men around Himmler, a displaced intellectual, for he had university degrees both in the law and in economics and had been a professor at the Institute for Applied Economic Science. All Jews and communist functionaries, Ohlendorf testified, were to be removed from the prisoner of war camps and were to be executed. To my knowledge, this action was carried out throughout the entire Russian campaign. But not without difficulties. Sometimes the Russian captives were so exhausted that they could not even walk to their execution. This brought a protest from Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, a dapper-looking fellow but also a cold, dispassionate killer. Müller was never apprehended after the war. He was last seen in Hitler's bunker in Berlin on April 29, 1945. Some of his surviving colleagues believe he is now in the service of the Soviet secret police, of which he was a great
I wonder
admirer.
if they ever caught him. But those
Commanders
Jewish
of the
people,
concentration camps are complaining that 5 to 10%
after what
of the
happened,
Soviet
they
Russians
put it
destined for
together and
execution
hunted them down.
are arriving in the camps dead or half dead. It was
Found them in
particularly noted that the
Argentina
march,
and
for
everything
example,
else.
From the railroad station to the camp, a rather large number of prisoners collapsed on the way from exhaustion, either dead or half dead, and had to be picked up by a truck following the convoy. It cannot
I
be
don't
prevented
blame
that the
them.
German people take notice of
Hunt
these
them down.
occurrences. The Gestapo didn't care a rap about the Russian captives falling dead from starvation and exhaustion, except that it robbed the executioners of their prey. But they didn't want the German people to see the spectacle. Gestapo Müller, as he was known in Germany,
No,
therefore
keep it to
ordered,
ourselves.
effective from today, November 9th, 1941, Soviet Russians obviously marked by death and who therefore are not able to withstand the exertions of even a short march, shall in the future be excluded from the transport into the concentration camps for execution.
The rest of it stay in Poland.
Dead prisoners or even starved and exhausted ones could not perform work. And in 1942, when it became obvious to the Germans that the war was going to last considerably longer than they had expected, and that the captive Soviet soldiers constituted a badly needed labor reservoir, the Nazis abandoned their policy of exterminating them in favor of working them. Himmler explained the change in his speech to the SS at Posen in 1943. At that time, 1941, we did not value the mass of humanity as we value it today, as raw material, as labor. What, after all, thinking in terms of generations, is not to be regretted but is now deplorable.
No, maybe we shouldn't have killed them all. We could have used them for working.
Tens and hundreds of thousands of exhaustion and hunger. They were now to be fed enough to enable them to work. By December
Just enough.
1944, 750,000 of them, including many officers, were toiling in the armament factories. The mines, where 200,000 were assigned. And on the farms, their treatment was harsh, but at least they were allowed to live. Even the branding of the Russian war captives, which General Keitel had proposed, was abandoned. On July 20th, 1942, Keitel had drafted the order. 1. Soviet prisoners of war are to be branded with a special and durable mark. 2. The brand is to consist of an acute angle of about 45 degrees with a 1 centimeter length of side, pointing downward on the left buttock at about a hand's width from the rectum. The treatment of Western prisoners of war, especially of the British and Americans, was comparatively milder than that meted out by the Germans to the Russians. There were occasional instances of the murder and massacre of them, but this was due usually to the excessive sadism and cruelty of individual commanders. Such a case was the slaughter in cold blood of 71 American prisoners of war in a field near Malmedy, Belgium, on December 17, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. There were other occasions.
That's when Uncle Steve was captured. They killed machine gun 71 of them. But somehow he wasn't in there. He wound up in a boxcar, going to a concentration camp. And then he said when they were freed by the Russians. And he says they were as bad as the Germans.
To encourage the killing of Allied airmen who had bailed out over Germany. Civilians were encouraged.
Right now I'm going to try to make a call to Kevin. He's got some pictures of Uncle Steve that I need. He mentioned to me that he was going to loan them to me. Well, I need those pictures.
Ribbentrop urged that airmen shot down be summarily executed, but Hitler took a somewhat milder view. On May 21st, 1944, in agreement with Goering, he merely ordered that captured flyers who had machine-gunned passenger trains or civilians or German planes, which had made emergency landings, be shot without court-martial. Sometimes captured flyers were simply turned over to the SD for special treatment. Thus, some 47 American, British, and Dutch flyers, all officers, were brutally murdered at Mauthausen concentration camp in September 1944. An eyewitness, Maurice Lamp, a French inmate at the camp, described at Nuremberg how it was done. The 47 officers were led barefooted to the quarry. At the bottom of the steps, the guards loaded stones on the backs of these poor men, and they had to carry them to the top. The first journey was made with stones weighing about 60 pounds and accompanied by blows. The second journey, the stones were still heavier, and whenever the poor wretches sank under their burden, they were kicked and hit with a bludgeon. In the evening, 21 bodies were strewn along the road. The 26 others died the following morning. This was a familiar form of execution at Mauthausen. It was used on, among others, a good many Russian prisoners of war. From 1942 on, that is when the tide of war began to surge against him, Hitler ordered the extermination of captured Allied commandos, especially in the West.
Kevin, this is Uncle Skip.
Summarily shot as a matter of course.
You mentioned those pictures of Uncle Steve. I'm going to do a little video in remembrance of him, and I need those pictures. So to borrow them from you. So if you would please get back to me, I'd appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Bye.
To be slaughtered to the last man. In a supplementary directive issued the same day, Hitler explained to his commanders the reason for his order. Because of the success of the Allied commandos, he said, "I have been compelled to issue strict orders for the destruction of enemy sabotage troops, and to declare non-compliance with these orders severely punishable. It must be made clear to the enemy that all sabotage troops will be exterminated without exception to the last man. This means that their chance of escaping with their lives is nil. Under no circumstances can they expect to be treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. If it should become necessary for reasons of interrogation to initially spare one man or two, then they are to be shot immediately after interrogation. This particular crime was to be kept strictly secret. General Jodl appended instructions to Hitler's directive, underlining his words. This order is intended for commanders only, and must not under any circumstances fall into enemy hands. They were directed to destroy all copies of it after they had duly
Keep
taken
it a secret.
It must have remained imprinted on their minds, for they proceeded to carry it out. A couple of instances of many may be given. On the night of March 22nd, 1944, 2 officers and 13 men of the 267th Special Reconnaissance Battalion of the U.S. Army landed from a naval craft far behind the German lines in Italy to demolish a railroad tunnel between La Spezia and Genoa. They were all
This is where Uncle Eddie wound up in Italy.
Captured 2 days later, they were executed by a firing squad on March 26th without trial, on the direct orders of General Anton Dostler, commander of the 75th.
Uncle Eddie, I can remember
military tribunal
as a
shortly after the war.
kid.
General Dostler
I'm behind.
justified his action by contending that he was
I'm
merely
7 or 8, 9 years younger, and he's going off to be going to the army, and I walked with him from Gordon Street to Main Street in South River, and he got on a bus, and he went to Italy. I guess the island off Italy, as I recall, Crete. That's where he wound up.
Parachuted into Slovakia in January 1945, were executed at Mauthausen concentration camp on the orders of Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the successor of Heydrich as head of the SD, one of the defendants at Nuremberg. Kaltenbrunner was hanged at Nuremberg jail on the night of October 15th to 16th,
And then
1946.
the only other one that that came back into this mind was we had an aunt on my mother's side. Her husband,
The files of the mass executions at this camp.
D-Day, killed on D-Day.
Nazi terror in the conquered lands. On October 22nd, 1941, a French newspaper, Le Phare,
That's when the
published the following
Corrie
article.
got sunk, the first Corrie. I was on the second
Bay
one.
of England and Moscow killed the film
The lead destroyer, the Corrie,
of October 20th.
sunk.
To now, the assassins have not been arrested. As expiation for this crime, I have ordered that 50
And the,
hostages be shot to begin with. 50 more hostages
Captain
will be
thought he
shot
was the
in
last
case
one
they
off the
will
ship,
not
but
be
no, there was
arrested.
one more guy.
Now and October 23rd,
He climbed the mast and put the American flag on the mast. Can you imagine that? Before it sunk.
Flag in France, Belgium, Holland, Norway, Poland, and Russia.
There wasn't much.
The proportion publicly proclaimed by the Germans was invariably one.
Those guys, they were the heroes.
Hostages shot for every German killed. Though the taking of hostages was an ancient custom, much indulged in
Led
by
by
the Romans,
Ike.
had not been generally practiced
Generalizing
in modern
it.
times, except by the Germans in the First World War and by the British in India and in South Africa during the Boer War. Under Hitler, however, the German army carried it out on a large scale during the Second War. Dozens of secret orders signed by General Keitel and lesser commanders.
My God, they didn't do it. Where would have if it wound up?
It is important, Keitel decreed on October 1st, 1941, that these should include well-known leading personalities or members of their families. And General von Stulpnagel, the German commander in France, a year later stressed that the better known the hostages to be shot, the greater will be the deterrent effect on the perpetrators. In all, 29,660 French hostages were executed by the Germans during the war, but this figure did not include the 40,000 who died in French prisons. The figure for Poland was 8,000, and for Holland, some 2,000. In Denmark, what became known as a system of clearing murders was substituted for the publicly proclaimed shooting of hostages. On Hitler's express orders, reprisals for the killing of Germans in Denmark were to be carried out in secret, on the proportion of 5 to 1. Thus, the great Danish pastor, poet, playwright Kai Munk, one of the most beloved men in Scandinavia, was brutally murdered by the Germans, his body left on the road with a sign pinned to it. Swine.
If
work
you
for
kill
Germany
one,
just the same.
they executed
Jews were
5
Of all
prisoners.
the war crimes which he claimed he had to commit on the orders of Hitler, the worst of all, General Keitel said on the stand at Nuremberg,
In public,
stemmed
so
from
they
the
would see it.
Nebel-Erlass, night and fog decree. This grotesque order, reserved for the unfortunate inhabitants of the conquered territories in the West, was issued by Hitler himself on December 7th, 1941. Its purpose, as the weird title indicates, was to seize persons endangering German security, who were not to be immediately executed, and make them vanish without a trace into the night and fog of the unknown in Germany. No information was to be given their families as to their
You just
fate, even
disappeared,
when
that's
this
it, you're
burial
gone.
occurred. It was merely a question of the place of burial and the rite. On December 12, 1941, Keitel issued a directive explaining the Führer's orders. In principle, he said, the punishment for offenses committed against the German state is the death penalty. But if these offenses are punished with imprisonment, even with hard labor for life, this will be looked upon as a sign of weakness. Efficient intimidation can only be achieved either by capital punishment or by measures by which the relatives of the criminal and the population do not know his fate. The following February, Keitel enlarged on the night and fog decree. In cases where the death penalty was not meted out within 8 days of a person's arrest, the prisoners are to be transported to Germany secretly. These measures will have a deterrent effect because, A, the prisoners will vanish without leaving a trace.
If you don't wipe them out, it's a
No information
sign
may
of
be given as to
weakness
their
on your
whereabouts
part.
or their
Oh,
fate. The SD was given charge of this macabre task, and its captured files are full of various orders pertaining to NN, or Nacht und Nebel, especially in regard to keeping the burial places of the victims strictly secret. How many Western Europeans disappeared into night and fog was never established at Nuremberg, but it appeared that few emerged from it alive. Some enlightening figures, however, were obtainable from the SD records concerning the number of victims of another terror operation in conquered territory which was applied to Russia. This particular exercise was carried out by what was known in Germany as the Einsatzgruppen, Special Action Groups, or what might better be termed in view of their performance, extermination squads. The first round figure of their achievement came out as if by accident.
extermination squads.
One day, sometime before the trial began, a young American naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Whitney R. Harris of the American Prosecution Staff, was interrogating Otto Ohlendorf on his wartime
This
activities.
bastard.
It was known that this attractive-looking German intellectual of youthful appearance, he was 38, had been head of Amt 3 of Himmler's Central Security Office, RSHA.
Heinrich
During the last years
Himmler.
of the war, had spent most of his time as a foreign trade expert in the Ministry of Economics. He told his interrogator that apart from 1 year, he had spent the war period on official duty in Berlin.
Former chicken farmer.
Asked what he had done during the year away, he replied, "I was chief of Einsatzgruppe D." Harris, a lawyer by training and by this time something of an intelligence authority on German affairs, knew quite a bit about the Einsatzgroups. So he asked promptly, "During the year you were chief of Einsatzgruppe D, how many men, women, and children did your group kill?" Ohlendorf, Harris later remembered, shrugged his shoulders and with only the slightest hesitation answered, 90,000. The Einsatzgroups had first been organized by Himmler and Heydrich to follow the German armies into Poland in 1939, and there round up the Jews and place them in ghettos. It was not until the beginning of the Russian campaign nearly 2 years later that, in agreement with the German army, they were ordered to follow the combat troops and to carry out one phase of the final solution. 4 Einsatzgruppen were formed for this purpose.
The final solution.
D. It was the
We're riding a
last
bus,
Ohlendorf commanded between June 1941
and the
and June
tour guide
1942,
lady,
and it was assigned the southernmost sector in Ukraine.
well
attached to
schooled.
the 11th Army.
and
Asked on the stand
and
by
she
Colonel John
narrated
Heyman what instructions it received.
as we drove. We were in Berlin and we
Instructions were
drove
the
through
Jews
that
and
area.
civil political commissars were to be liquidated.
More so it was on
When
the
you say
way back
liquidated, do you mean killed?
when we passed where they had the meeting.
Yes, I mean
Hey,
killed.
this is the way we're going to handle it. The final
Explaining
solution.
that this took in the women and children as well as the men. For what reason were the children massacred? The Russian judge, General I.T. Nikitchenko, broke in to ask. Ollendorf. The order was that the Jewish population should be totally exterminated. The judge, including the children. Ollendorf. Yes. The judge. Were all the Jewish children murdered? Ollendorf. Yes. In response to further questioning by Haman and in his affidavit, Ollendorf described how a typical killing took place. The Einsatz unit would enter a village or town and order the prominent Jewish citizens to call together all Jews for the purpose of resettlement, i.e. they were told they were being resettled elsewhere. They were requested to hand over their valuables and shortly before execution to surrender their outer clothing. They were transported to the place of executions, usually an anti-tank ditch, in trucks. Always only as many as could be executed immediately. In this way it was attempted to keep the span of time from the moment in which the victims knew what was about to happen to them until the time of their actual execution as short as possible. Then they were shot, kneeling or standing, by firing squads in a military manner.
Lest they realize it cause a commotion.
I never permitted the shooting by individuals.
I'll tell you what, if I was about to be shot, I'd be trying to everybody would be.
Other group leaders demanded that the victims lie down flat on the ground to be shot through the nape of the neck. I did not approve of these methods.
They don't kneel down and they're going to shoot me? Jesus.
Because, replied Ollendorf, both for the victims and for those who carried out the executions, it was psychologically an immense burden to bear. In the spring of 1942, Ollendorf then recounted, an order came from Himmler to change the method of execution of the women and children. There was a special reason for this. Henceforth, they were to be dispatched in gas vans, specially constructed for the purpose by 2 Berlin firms. The SD officer described to the tribunal how these remarkable vehicles worked. The actual purpose of these vans could not be seen from the outside. They looked like closed trucks and were so constructed that at the start of the motor, the gas, exhaust, was conducted into the van, causing death in 10 to 15 minutes. How were the victims induced to enter the vans? Colonel Amon wanted to know. They were told they were to be transported to another locality, Ollendorf replied. Ollendorf was tried at Nuremberg by a U.S. military tribunal, along with 21 others in the Einsatzgruppen case. 14 of them were condemned to death. Only 4, Ollendorf and 3 other group commanders, were executed on June 8, 1951 at Landsberg prison, some 3.5 years after being sentenced. The death penalties for the others were commuted. The burial of the victims of the gas vans, he went on to complain, was a great ordeal for the members of the Einsatzgruppen. This was confirmed by a certain Dr. Becker, whom Ollendorf identified as the constructor of the vans, in a document produced at Nuremberg. In a letter to headquarters, Dr. Becker objected to German SD men having to unload the corpses of the gassed women and children, calling attention to the immense psychological injuries and damage to their health which that work can have for these men. They complained to me about headaches which appeared after each unloading. Dr. Becker also pointed out to his superiors that the application of gas usually is not undertaken correctly. In order to come to an end as fast as possible, the driver presses the accelerator to the fullest extent. The persons to be executed suffer death from suffocation, and not death by dozing off, as was planned. Dr. Becker was quite a humanitarian, in his own mind, and ordered a change in technique. My directions now have proved that by correct adjustment of the levers, death comes
Do it the
faster
right
when
way.
prisoners fall asleep
Floor the
peacefully.
accelerator.
Distorted faces and excretions, such as could be seen before, are
Oh
no
my
longer
God.
noticed. But the gas vans, as Ollendorf testified, could dispatch only from 15 to 25 persons at a time, and this was entirely inadequate for the massacres on the scale which Hitler and Himmler had ordered. Inadequate, for example, for the job that was done at Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, in just 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, when, according to an official Einsatz report, 33,771 persons, mostly Jews, were executed. An eyewitness report by a German of how a comparatively minor mass execution was carried out in the Ukraine brought a hush of horror over the Nuremberg courtroom when it was read by the chief British prosecutor, Sir Hartley Shawcross. It was a sworn affidavit by Hermann Grebe, a the manager and engineer of a branch office in the Ukraine of a German construction firm. On October 5th, 1942, he witnessed the Einsatz commandos, supported by Ukrainian militia, in action at the execution pits at Dubno in the Ukraine. It was a matter, he reported, of liquidating the town's 5,000 Jews. My foreman and I went directly to the pits. I heard rifle shots in quick succession from behind one of the earth mounds. The people who had got off the trucks, men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress upon the order of an SS man who carried a riding or dog whip. They had to put down their clothes in fixed places, sorted according to shoes, top clothing, and underclothing. I saw a heap of shoes of about 800 to 1,000 pairs, great piles of underlinen and clothing. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood around in family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man who stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. During the 15 minutes that I stood near the pit, I heard no complaint or plea for mercy. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding a 1-year-old child in her arms and singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The parents were looking on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. The father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man at the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 persons and instructed them to go behind the earth mound. I well remember a girl, slim and with black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed to herself and said, 23 years old. I walked around the mound and found myself confronted by a tremendous grave. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. Nearly all had blood running over their shoulders from their heads. Some of the people were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show that they were still alive. The pit was already 2/3 full. I estimated that it contained about 1,000 people. I looked for the man who did the shooting. He was an SS man who sat at the edge of the narrow end of the pit, his feet dangling into the pit. He had a Tommy gun on his knees and was smoking a cigarette. The people, completely naked, went down some steps and clambered over the heads of the people lying there to the place to which the SS man directed them. They lay down in front of the dead or wounded people. Some caressed those who were still alive and spoke to them in a low voice. Then I heard a series of shots. I looked into the pit and saw that the bodies were twitching, or the heads lying already motionless on top of the bodies that lay beneath them. Blood was running from their necks. The next batch was approaching already.
My
They went
God,
down
what
into
a
the pit, lined
description.
themselves up
What a
against the previous
description. Ay,
victims,
ay, ay, ay,
and were
ay.
shot. And so it went, batch after batch. The next morning, the German engineer returned to the site. I saw about 30 naked people lying near the pit. Some of them were still alive. Later, the Jews still alive were ordered to throw the corpses into the pit. Then they themselves had to lie down in this to be shot in the neck.
God almighty.
I swear before God that this is the absolute truth.
He swears
How many
it's the
Jews
truth.
and Russian Communist Party functionaries, the former vastly outnumber the latter, were massacred by the Einsatzgruppen in Russia before the Red Army drove the Germans out? The exact total could never be computed at Nuremberg, but Himmler's records, uncoordinated as they were, give a rough idea. Ohlendorf's Einsatzgruppen D, with its 90,000 victims, did not do as well as some of the other groups. Group A, for instance, in the north, reported on January 31st, 1942, that it had executed 229,052 Jews in the Baltic region and in White Russia. Its commander, Franz Stahlecker, reported to Himmler that he was having difficulty in the latter province because of a late start after the heavy frost set in, which made mass executions much more difficult. Nevertheless, he reported, 41,000 Jews in White Russia have been shot up to now. Stahlecker, who was disposed of later in the year by Soviet partisans, enclosed with his report a handsome map showing the number of those done to death, symbolized by coffins, in each area under his command. In Lithuania alone, the map showed 136,421 Jews had been slain.
Lithuania,
Some 34,000 had been
Latvia,
spared for
and
the time
Estonia
being, as they were
lie
needed for
between
labor.
Poland and
Estonia, which had relatively few Jews, was declared in
and
this
Russia,
report to be Jew-free.
and we had the chance to
The Einsatzgruppen firing squads, after a let-up during the severe winter,
go
banged
there.
away all through the summer of 1942.
Doris and I, and one of the trips.
55,000 more Jews were exterminated in White Russia by July 1st, and in October the remaining 16,200 inhabitants of the Minsk ghetto were dispatched in one day. By November, Himmler could report to Hitler that 363,211 Jews had been killed in Russia from August through October, though the figure was probably somewhat exaggerated.
All those countries
to please the
wound up
bloodthirsty Führer.
communist under
On
Russia.
August 31st, Himmler had ordered an
There was no
Einsatz
visiting
detachment to
anything.
execute 100 inmates of the Minsk prison.
Germany was divided
could see
into
how it was done.
two, north
According
and
to Bakselevsky,
the Berlin
high
Wall
officer in
and
the
the-
SS
and
who was
everything.
present, Himmler almost swooned when he saw the effect of the first volley from the firing squad. A few minutes later, when the shots
Yeah, he
failed
couldn't
to
take it.
kill
The chicken
two
farmer
Jewish
couldn't
women
take it.
outright, the SS
But he gave
Führer
the
became
orders.
hysterical. One result of this experience was an order from Himmler that henceforth the women and children should not be shot, but dispatched in the gas vans.
That's it. Be decent
All in
with them.
all,
Put them in the
according to
gas
Karl
chambers.
Eichmann, the head of the Jewish office of the Gestapo, 2 million persons, almost all Jews, were liquidated by the Einsatzgruppen in the East. But this is almost certainly an exaggeration.
And
It is
then
strange but true
the other
that
story,
SS bigwigs were so
the
proud
first
of their
time we went to Europe, I
exterminations
drove.
that they often reported swollen
I got a
figures
license and I
please
drove
Himmler
to
and
Europe.
Hitler. Himmler's own statistician,
And,
Dr. Richard Korher, reported to his chief
It was a
on
good
March
trip. I
23rd,
read Rick
1943,
Steves' book
that a
and
total of
studied it for months.
633,300 Jews in Russia had
We
been
went to all the different places that he recommended, stayed in people's homes and all. It was a good. My daughter went with too. Brenda went with.
later made by a number of experts.
And the kid
Had
drove
another
in
100,000 slain in the last 2 years of the war.
in Germany, you know.
The figure is probably
Rented
as
a car
accurate as
from
we will
Hertz.
ever have. A
And
number of Soviet Communist Party functionaries slain by the Einsatzgruppen.
like I
has
said,
never
the
been
language
estimated
barrier
as
was
high.
tough. Doris got to
Those
visit
reports
Firmenich,
together with the Jews.
the parent
The report
company.
of Group A, dated October 15th, 1941,
And when we but at the end of the trip, we drove down, we slept near the airport.
executed. The
And
rest being
I,
Jews. But the same report often lists
for the next, we're flying home, and when we went to the
High as
airport,
it is small
when we went to
compared
the,
number of Jews who were done to death in Himmler's
airport the
extermination
following
camps.
morning, oh, there's the Hertz
Final
garage, good,
solution came to be
jeez, no
carried.
problem. Drove up in the parking garage,
Final solution. One
Parked the
fine
car,
June day of 1946,
noted that where I parked it,
members of the American
and we went to the
prosecution
trailer.
staff were interrogating
Doris
SS Uber
didn't find the
operator
papers
Oswald
for
Kohl, who,
in
among
her
other
that
things, had been in
pocketbook
charge of work
for the
projects
moment,
the inmates of
you
the
know.
Nazi concentration camps.
And
Paul, a
we didn't
naval
have the
officer before
papers,
he joined
the-
the SS,
the-
had gone into
from Hertz.
hiding after the German collapse.
and
Not been
the guy,
apprehended
that
until a year
German,
later,
decided to
in May
rob
1946,
the
when he
car.
was discovered working on a farm disguised as a farmhand.
And
Paul was condemned to death
I
in the
started to
so-called
get an inkling.
concentration
I said,
camp
the next thing
by a
he'd be,
US military
that he'll
tribunal
say the car ain't
on
there.
November 3rd,
And him and I
1947.
went up there, and the
Hanged in
car's
Landsberg
not
prison
there.
on
They
June 8th,
moved it. The
1951,
Berlin
along with
Wall
all
was
others.
there, and they're gonna. Oh yeah.
In answer to one
I almost had a
question,
fist
Paul
fight
used
with
a
the
term
bastard.
which the Nuremberg prosecution
Go,
busy
get
for
on the
months
plane and
supporting
go.
over millions of
And they'll
words from
charge
captured
charge you for a
documents
car
had
or
begun to
something.
become familiar.
Jesus, man.
A certain colleague by the name
And
of
then we
Ernst
found the
Paul
papers, and I
said,
seen to
"Been
it that
employed
things
by
got
Hitler
straightened
in the
out
final solution of the
before we
Jewish
left.
question." And what was that?
They
Paul
were
was
still
asked.
fighting the war, brother.
The extermination
They were
of
still
Jewry,
fighting
he
the war,
answered.
and I was an American.
The expression crept with increasing frequency into the vocabulary and the files of the leading Nazis as the war progressed, its seeming innocence apparently sparing these men the pain of reminding one another what it meant. And perhaps, too, they may have thought furnishing a certain cover for their guilt should the incriminating papers ever come to light. Indeed, at the Nuremberg trials, most of the Nazi chiefs denied that they knew what it signified, and Goering contended he had never used the term, but this pretense was soon exploded. In the case against the fat Reich Marshal, a directive was produced which he had sent
That
Heydrich,
fat
the chief
bastard.
of the SD, on July 31st, 1941, when the Einsatzgruppen were already falling with gusto to their extermination tasks in Russia. I herewith commission you, Goering instructed Heydrich, to carry out all preparations with regard to a total solution of the Jewish question in those territories of Europe which are under German influence. I furthermore charge you to submit to me as soon as possible a draft showing the measures already taken for the execution of the intended final solution of the Jewish question. A faulty translation of the last line, rendering the
this
German
is the
word
guy here
Endlösung as
at
desired
Auschwitz,
solution
the
instead of
commander.
final solution in the English copy of the document, led Justice Jackson, who did not know German, to allow Goering under cross-examination to get away with his contention that he never used the sinister term. "The first time I learned of these terrible exterminations," Goering exclaimed at one point, "was right here in Nuremberg." Heydrich knew very well what Goering meant by the term, for he had used it himself nearly a year before at a secret meeting after the fall of Poland, in which he had outlined the first step in the final solution, which consisted of concentrating all the Jews in the ghettos of the large cities, where it would be easy to dispatch them to their final fate. As it worked out, the final solution was what Adolf Hitler had long had in mind, and what he had publicly proclaimed even before the war started. In his speech to the Reichstag on January 30th, 1939, he had said, "If the international Jewish financiers should again succeed in plunging the nations into a world war, the result will be the annihilation of the Jewish race throughout Europe." This was a prophecy, he said, and he repeated it 5
This
times
was
verbatim in
his
subsequent
intent.
public utterances.
Kill them all.
It made no difference that not the international Jewish financiers, but he himself plunged the world into armed conflict. What mattered to Hitler was that there was now a world war, and that it afforded him, after he had conquered
I
vast
may have some
regions in the
German
east where
blood
most
in
of
me,
Europe's
with me,
Jews
but
lived,
dry God, I
the
don't
opportunity
agree
to
with.
carry out their annihilation. By the time the invasion
This
of Russia
type of
began, he had
thinking.
given the necessary orders. What became known in high Nazi circles as the Führer Order on the Final Solution apparently was never committed to paper. At least no copy of it has yet
Oh,
been
no,
unearthed in
don't
the
commit it to
captured Nazi
paper.
documents. All the evidence shows that it was most probably given verbally to Goering, Himmler, and Heydrich.
Don't have the
passed it down
balls
during
to
the
do
summer and
that.
fall of 1941. A number of witnesses testified at Nuremberg that they had heard of it, but none admitted ever seeing it. Thus Hans Lammers, the bull-headed chief of the Reich Chancellery, when pressed on the witness stand, replied, "I knew that a Führer order was transmitted by Goering to Heydrich. This order was called Final Solution of the Jewish Problem." But Lammers claimed, as did so many others on the stand, that he did not really know what it was all about until Allied counsel revealed it at Nuremberg. Lammers was sentenced in April 1949 to 20 years imprisonment by a U.S. military tribunal at Nuremberg, chiefly because of his
I
responsibility
might
in
add
the anti-Jewish decrees.
that
But
with
as in
that
the case of
incident
most
at
of the other
the
convicted Nazis,
parking
whose
garage
sentences
in
were
Germany,
greatly
me
reduced by the American
parking the car, the
authorities,
kid
his
parking
term
the
was
car
commuted
there,
in
they're
1951
gonna
to
rob
10
it.
years.
They
He was
moved
released
it.
from
They were
Munster
robbing
prison
it.
at the end of that year, after serving a total of 6 years from the date of his first imprisonment.
When I got home, I called Hertz and I explained to them there was not a doubt in my mind they were robbing that vehicle.
Did not approve of even the relatively
And I
mild
received a letter
sentences
back from
meted out to
Hertz
Hitler's
saying that
accomplices. A number of them handed over
they
by the Allies
apologized
to
for the
German custody
inconvenience
were
and
not
all,
even
and that I would be
prosecuted.
taken
Even when
care
they
of
were
it. And
accused
they,
of mass murder.
I didn't
Some
need
of
any
them quickly
taken
found
care of. I
employment
just
in the
wanted
government.
it to be noted.
By the
That's
beginning
all.
of 1942,
They
the
took care
time
of
had
me.
come, as Heydrich said, to clear up the fundamental problems of the final solution so that it could at last be carried out and concluded. For this purpose, Heydrich convened a meeting of representatives of the various ministries and agencies of the SSSD at the pleasant Berlin suburb of Wannsee on January 20th, 1942, the minutes of which played an important part in some of the later Nuremberg trials. Despite the current setback of the Wehrmacht in Russia, the Nazi officials believed that the war was almost won, and that Germany would shortly be ruling all of Europe, including England and Ireland. Therefore, Heydrich told the assembly of some 15 high officials,
Gonna rule
"In the
everything.
course of this final solution of the European Jewish problem, approximately 11 million Jews are involved." He then rattled off the figures for each country. There were only 131,800 Jews left in the original Reich territory, out of 250,000 in 1939. But in the USSR, he said there were 5 million, in the Ukraine 3 million, in the general government of Poland 2.25 million, in France 750,000, and in England 1/3 The clear implication was that all 11 million must be exterminated. He then explained how this considerable task was to be carried out. The Jews should now, in the course of the final solution, be brought to the east for use as labor. In big labor gangs with separation of sexes, the Jews capable of work are brought to these areas and employed in road building, in which task undoubtedly a great part will fall through natural diminution. The remnant that finally is able to survive all this, since this is undoubtedly the part with the strongest resistance, must be treated accordingly, since these people, representing a natural selection, are to be regarded as the germ cell of a new Jewish development. In other words, the Jews of Europe were first to be transported to the conquered East, then worked to death, and the few tough ones who survived simply put to death. And the Jews, the millions of them who resided in the East and were already on hand, State Secretary Dr. Joseph Buehler, representing the Governor General of Poland, had a ready suggestion for them. There were nearly 2.5 million Jews in Poland, he said, who constituted a great danger. They were, he explained, bearers of disease,
How
black
could
market
they
operators, and
hate
furthermore unfit for work.
to that degree?
There was no
I don't
transportation
know.
problem with these 2.5 million souls. They were already
I suppose
I have only one
they've done
request,
things to
Dr.
them.
Buehler
To them
concluded,
that
the Jewish
you know, there's got to be
problem in
two
my territory
sides to
be
an
solved
argument.
as quickly as possible.
But still,
The
it
State
doesn't
Secretary
warrant that
betrayed
kind
an
of
impatience which was shared in high
kind of
Nazi
going on.
circles right
I
at the
had
end.
one incident when I was
None
in
of
the
them
Navy
understood
with
at this
it.
time, not in fact until
As I
toward
was
the end of 1942,
listening to
when it
this,
was too late.
one incident, I was on the tender at the time, the last ship,
At this point, they only
and we
understood
played
that
some
working
cards.
millions of Jews to death on the roads
And I
of
won a
Russia
little
would
money
take
from
some
this
time.
young Jewish young
Consequently,
man.
long before these unfortunate people could be worked
And
to
then,
death, in most cases the attempt
when it
was
come
not
time
even
to pay,
begun. Hitler and Himmler
he wasn't
decided
gonna
to
pay.
dispatch them by quicker means.
And
Two, principally. One of them, as we have seen,
what it
had
was, he in his mind drew a card and says, "I won."
This was the method of mass
You won what?
Polish and Russian Jews by the
I didn't
flying,
bet
firing
you on that
squads of
card.
Einsatzgruppen, which accounted
Oh, I
for
won.
750,000.
We had an argument,
It was this
a
method of
further
achieving the
argument.
final solution that Himmler
And
had in
I-
mind when he addressed the SS generals at Posen
He-
on October 4th.
You're not supposed to fight on a ship. I forgot about this fight. I
I
forgot
also
completely
want to
about
talk
it.
to you quite frankly
He
on a
tried to
very
stab me
grave
with a screwdriver.
Among ourselves, it should be mentioned quite frankly,
And
and yet we will never speak of it publicly.
I got the best of him. I got the best of him. And the guys
Most of you must know it.
hit it all, calmed it all down into nothing. And they told him, "You better pay that guy or he's going to do that to you every time every payday." And he paid.
To have remained decent fellows.
So be it, but you don't
That is what has made us hard.
you don't
This is a page of glory
do
in our
things like
history
that.
which has never
You
been
know,
written
this is
and
not
has never
that
to be
one
written.
from one example of an
No doubt
incident.
the
No,
bespectacled SS
no.
Führer, who had almost fainted at the
You
sight
don't
of
do
100
things
Eastern
like that.
Jews, including women being executed for his own delectation, would have seen in the efficient working by SS officers of the gas chambers in the extermination camps an even more glorious page in German history. For it was in these death camps that the final solution achieved its most ghastly success. The extermination camps. All the 30-odd principal Nazi concentration camps were death camps. Millions of tortured, starved inmates perished in them. Kogan estimates the number at 7,125,000 out of a total of 7,820,000 inmates, but the figure undoubtedly is too high. Kogan, The Theory and Practice of Hell, page 227. Though the authorities kept records, each camp had its official Totenbuch, death book, they were incomplete and in many cases were destroyed as the victorious Allies closed in. Part of one Totenbuch that survived at Mauthausen listed 35,318 deaths from January 1939 to April 1945. The camp commander, Franz Ziereis, put the total number at 65,000. At the end of 1942, when the need of slave labor began to be acute, Himmler ordered that the death rate in the concentration camps must be reduced. Because of the labor shortage, he had been displeased at a report received in his office that of the 136,700 commitments to concentration camps between June and November 1942, some 70,610 had died, and that in addition, 9,267 had been executed and 27,846 transferred. To the gas chamber, that is. This did not leave very many for labor duties. But it was in the extermination camps, the Vernichtungslager, where most progress was made toward the final solution. The greatest and most renowned of these was Auschwitz, whose 4 huge gas chambers and adjoining crematoria gave it a capacity for death
Here
and
we
burial
are, back to
far beyond that of the
Auschwitz.
others. Treblinka, Belzec,
We made 2 trips
Sobibor,
there.
and Chelmno, all in Poland.
The
There were
first
other minor
one,
extermination camps near
almost
Riga,
20 years
Vilna,
before the
Minsk,
second one.
Kaunas, and Lvov. But they
Close
were
to 20.
distinguished from the main ones in that they killed by shooting rather than by
It must have been
gas.
20.
For a time, there was quite a bit of rivalry among the SS leaders as to which was the most efficient gas to speed the Jews to their death. Speed was an important factor, especially at Auschwitz, where toward the end the camp was setting new records by gassing 6,000 victims a day. One of the camp's commanders for a period was Rudolf Höss, an ex-convict once
This is
found
the
guilty
guy.
of murder, who
This is
deposed
the
at
guy.
Nuremberg on the superiority of the gas he employed. Born in 1900, the son of a small shopkeeper in Baden-Baden,
On
Höss
this-
was pressured by his pious
Notice
Catholic
that.
father to become a
Baden-Baden.
priest.
He was
Instead,
born
he
in
joined the Nazi
Baden-Baden.
Party in 1922.
Maximilian was
He was
born
implicated in the
come
murder
from
of a school
Baden-Baden. The
teacher
Baileys
who
come from
allegedly had
Baden-Baden.
denounced
Oh,
Leo Schlageter, the German saboteur in the Ruhr, who was executed by the French and became a Nazi martyr. Höss received a life sentence. He was released in a general amnesty in 1928, joined the SS 2 years later, and in 1934 became a member of the Death's Head group of the SS, whose principal job was the guarding of the concentration camps. His first job in this unit was at Dachau. Thus he spent almost his entire adult life, first as a prisoner, and then as a
so the
jailer.
first time I didn't even
Freely,
recall
and even
that
exaggeratedly testified to his killings
when
both
I
on the
stood
stand
where
in
it-
Nuremberg
where they
and in
hung him.
affidavits for the prosecution.
in
Turned over
1946,
later
I
to the
believe,
Poles, he was sentenced to death,
at
and
the
in March
camp.
1947 hanged at Auschwitz, the scene of his greatest crimes.
That's what I'm referring
The final
to.
solution
But
of
I
the Jewish
seen it,
question
and
meant the
Jeannie
complete
will recall.
extermination of all Jews in
We
Europe.
stood there.
I was ordered to establish extermination facilities at Auschwitz in June 1941. At that time, there were already in the general government of Poland 3 other extermination camps.
Probably my second
Belzec,
time. I
Treblinka,
didn't
and
even
Volzek.
didn't penetrate the
I
first
visited
time.
Treblinka to find out how they carried out their extermination. The camp commandant at Treblinka told me that he had liquidated 80,000 in the course of half a year. He was principally concerned with liquidating all the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, a task which, because of the large numbers involved and because of, at the end, armed resistance,
Doris
would not
commented
be
to me
completed,
this
as we
morning
shall see, until 1943.
that the second time was more.
He used monoxide gas, and I did not think that his methods were very efficient. So when I set up the extermination building at Auschwitz, I used Zyklon B, which was a crystallized prussic acid, which we dropped into the death chamber from a small opening.
I don't know. I'm
It
losing
took
a
from
word.
3 to
Think I
15
gotta think
minutes
about
to kill
it.
the people in the death chamber, depending upon climatic conditions. We knew when the people were dead because their screaming stopped. We usually waited about a half hour before we opened
Made
the
to
doors
look
and removed
nicer
the
and all
bodies.
the camp and
After the bodies were
or
removed, our
whatever.
special commandos
Not
took off the
belittling
rings
it
and
and,
extracted the gold from
that
the
what
teeth
went
of the
on there and all,
corpses.
but
Another improvement we made over Treblinka was that we built our gas
more
chambers to
toward the,
accommodate 2,000 people at one time, whereas at Treblinka, their 10 gas chambers only accommodated 200 people each.
I
Höss then
can't get it
explained how
across at
victims
the
were
moment.
selected for the gas chambers, since not all the incoming prisoners were done away with. At least not at once, because some of them were needed to labor in the IG Farben chemical works and Krupp's factory until they became exhausted and were ready for the final solution. We had 2 SS doctors on duty at Auschwitz to examine the incoming transports of prisoners. These would be marched by one of the doctors, who would make spot decisions as they walked by. Those who were fit to work were sent into the camp. Others were sent immediately to the extermination plants. Children of
Maybe
tender years were invariably
the first trip
exterminated,
might have been
since by
around
reason of their
1990. It's the first trip I made to Europe.
Always
That first
Höss
trip.
kept making improvements in the art of mass killing. Still another improvement we made over
I know the
Treblinka
Berlin
was
Wall was
at
there.
Treblinka, the victims
When did the
almost always knew
Berlin
that they
Wall
would
come
be
down?
exterminated, while at
It was
Auschwitz,
before that.
we endeavored to fool the victims
Before
into
it come
thinking
down.
that they were to go through a delousing process. Of course, frequently they realized our true intentions, and we sometimes had riots and difficulties. Very frequently, women would hide their children under the clothes, but of course, when we found them, we would send the children in to be exterminated.
I seen this
We were
guy's
required
house.
to carry out
By the
these
way, when we
exterminations in
approach
secrecy, but of course, the
Auschwitz,
foul and nauseating stench from
it
the
was kind
continuous
of
burning of bodies
maybe
permeated
a
the
little bit
entire
wet.
area,
Not
and all of the people
much
living in
there by the
surrounding
toward the
communities
camp for
knew
the
extermination
little
was going
town,
on
and
in
then
Auschwitz.
and 2 miles of
Sometimes, Höss explained, a few
like Journey Mill Road before you got to the camp.
Were simply killed by injections
And kind of
Our
a
doctors,
little bit of a wet area, like swampy or something.
Usually, heart disease was written down. Kogan, himself in Buchenwald for 8 years, gives samples. Patient died after prolonged suffering on blank at blank o'clock. Cause of death, cardiac weakness complicated by pneumonia. Kogan, The Theory and Practice of Hell, page 218. Such formalities were dispensed with at Auschwitz when the massive gassings began. Often the day's dead were not even counted. To Hearst's blunt description may be added a brief composite picture of death and disposal at Auschwitz, as testified to by surviving inmates and jailers. The selection which decided which Jews were to be worked and which ones immediately gassed took place at the railroad siding as soon as the victims had been unloaded from the freight cars in which they had been locked without food or water for as much as a week. For many came from such
If I might
distant parts
suggest,
as France, Holland, and Greece.
Winds of War.
Though there were heartrending
Winds of
scenes
War
as
with
wives were
Robert
torn away from
Mitchum and all.
husbands and children from parents, none of the captives, as Hearst testified and survivors agreed, realized just what was in store for them. In fact, some of them were given pretty picture postcards
Although there was two of them, Winds of War and War and Peace.
back home to their relatives with a printed inscription
I've
saying,
seen them
"We are
both
doing
and all,
very well
but
here. We have work and we are well treated. We await your arrival."
I may even
Gas
have
chambers themselves
copies
and
of
the
it.
adjoining crematoria,
Someone
even
was
from a short
interested.
distance, were not sinister-looking places at all. It was impossible to make them out for what they were. Over them were well-kept lawns with flower borders. The signs at the entrances merely said baths. The unsuspecting Jews thought they were simply being taken to the baths for the delousing, which was
This is
customary
the way
at all camps.
that Doris's
Taken to the
explanation.
accompaniment of sweet music.
From the first time to the second time, it made it look like it was,
An orchestra of young and
oh,
pretty girls,
nice
all dressed
place.
in white blouses and navy blue skirts, as one survivor
He's
remembered,
explaining it for me.
had been formed from among the inmates. While the selection was being made for the gas chambers, this unique musical ensemble played gay tunes from The Merry Widow and Tales of Hoffmann. Nothing
Yeah,
solemn
this is kind of the way it is now. Little, not really, but
were sprightly and
maybe
merry
close to
tunes,
it.
straight out of Viennese and Parisian operetta. To such music, recalling as it did happier and more frivolous times, the men, women, and children were led into the bathhouses, where they were told to undress preparatory to taking a shower. Sometimes they were even given towels. Once they were inside the shower room, and perhaps this was the first
Me, they
moment
only,
they
when I went in the
suspected
Navy, they only
something
threw a box in front of me. Put your clothes in it. You belong to us. That's all.
Sardines, making it difficult to take a bath.
Nothing like this.
The massive door was slid shut, locked, and hermetically sealed. Up above, where the well-groomed lawn and flower beds almost concealed the mushroom-shaped lids of vents that ran up from the Hall of Death, orderlies stood ready to drop into them the amethyst-blue crystals of hydrogen cyanide, or Zyklon B, which originally
I've seen all those
cans,
cans, left over, rusted, laying there. Piles of shoes, piles of eyeglasses.
Surviving prisoners watching from blocks nearby remembered how for a time the signal for the orderlies to pour the crystals down the vents was given by a Sergeant Moll. "Na, gib ihm schon zu fressen." All right, give him something to chew on. He would
Give him
laugh,
something to
and
chew on.
crystals would be poured through the openings, which were then sealed. Through heavy glass portholes, the executioners could watch what happened. The naked prisoners below would be looking up at the showers from which no water spouted, or perhaps at the floor wondering why there were no drains. It took some moments for the gas to have much effect.
Jesus
Soon the
have
inmates
mercy.
became aware that it was issuing from the perforations in the vents. It was then that they usually panicked, crowding away from the pipes and finally stampeding toward the huge metal door where, as Reitlinger puts it,
Those buildings were like
one blue, clammy, blood-spattered pyramid, clawing and mauling each
buildings
other
at Camp
even in
Kilmer.
death.
Better buildings than that were at Camp Kilmer. Before when
Pumps drew out the poisonous air. The large door was
before
opened.
Camp Kilmer became what it is today.
These were Jewish male inmates
In New
who
Brunswick.
promised their lives and
I worked there quite a bit.
in return for performing the most
On those
ghastly
barracks,
job
there
of
were
all.
barracks where that's where they kept the.
Regularly
I
dispatched in the
I remember
gas
them
chambers
saying
replaced
Italian and
volunteers who
Japanese
continued to meet the
prisoners.
same fate. The SS wanted no survivors to tell tales. Protected with gas masks and rubber boots and wielding hoses, they went to work. Reitlinger has described it. Their first task was to remove the blood and defecations before dragging the claw.
Now all that fighting and all the Japanese and everything, kamikaze planes and all, and now it's okay.
Then the journey by lift or rail wagon to the furnaces, the mill that ground the clinker to fine ash.
The war is forgotten. The war is forgotten. And Japanese pitcher for the Yankees now, and there's been players for years and all. They're not bad people, you know. What the hell causes all this?
Constructed an electrically heated tank for making soap out of human fat.
A lot of it revolves around oil. It revolves around oil. Talk about chaos. If that thing ever it's pouring out of the ground, from animals. From animals. How the hell many animals could there have been? I think there's more to it than that. If you ever shut that, the good Lord shuts that faucet off or something, there's going to be one hell of a commotion.
Was revealed in a voluminous correspondence found in the records of the camp. A letter from the firm dated February 12, 1943 gives the tenor. To the Central Construction Office of the SS and Police, Auschwitz. Subject, Crematoria 2 and 3 for the camp. We acknowledge receipt of your order for 5 triple furnaces, including 2 electric elevators for raising the corpses and 1 emergency elevator. A practical installation for stoking coal was also ordered and 1 for transporting ashes. The correspondence of 2 other firms
the businessmen selling
popped
things
up at the Nuremberg trials. The disposal of the corpses at a number of Nazi camps had attracted commercial competition. One of the oldest German companies in the field offered its drawings for crematoria to be built at a large SS camp in Belgrade. For putting the bodies into the furnace, we suggest simply a
couple of little thoughts probably come in my video, a higher being.
As coffins will not be used.
You got to watch that somewhere along the line in life. A higher being. I mean,
using light carts on wheels, and we enclose diagrams of these drawn to scale.
it might be entertaining.
Another firm, C.H. Corey, also sought the Belgrade business, emphasizing its great experience in this field since it had already constructed 4 furnaces for Dachau and 5
Kids
for
thought
the
about
which it
that.
said had given full satisfaction
You know,
in practice.
I said to Ronnie, if there's heaven, I don't know. If there's anything, try to get back to me and let me know, you know.
Cremation ovens which operate with coal and which have hitherto
You're,
given full satisfaction.
he was on his way
We
there.
suggest 2 crematoria furnaces for the building planned, but we advise you to make further inquiries
like
to make
always,
sure that 2 ovens will be sufficient for your requirements.
He never got back to me.
We guarantee the effectiveness of the cremation ovens as well as their durability, the use of the best material and our faultless workmanship. Awaiting your further
Not
work,
yet, anyway.
be at your service. Heil Hitler, C.H. Corey, GmbH.
Corey, I
In the
was
end,
on a
even the
Corey.
strenuous
He got
efforts of
sunk.
German
The
pre-enterprise,
first one got
using
sunk.
the best material and providing faultless workmanship, proved inadequate for burning the corpses. The well-constructed crematoria fell far behind at a number of camps, but especially at Auschwitz
When we picked
in
out them,
1944. when as
the
many as
ships, there
6,000
was
bodies, Hearst,
20 destroyers out of Norfolk.
16,000.
And Corey was famous. He's been
For
sunk.
instance, in 46
That's where I want to
days
go.
during
Put
the
me
summer
on
of
it.
1944,
That's the
between
one I took.
250,000 and 300,000
Proud to be
Hungarian
able to
Jews
serve
alone
on
were
it.
done to death at this camp. Even the gas chambers fell behind, and resort was made to mass shootings in the Einsatzkommando style. The bodies were simply thrown into ditches and burned, many of them only partly, and then earth was bulldozed over them. The camp commanders complained toward the end that the crematoria had proved not only inadequate, but uneconomical. The Zyklon B crystals that killed the victims in the first place were furnished by
God, you gotta be proud of the Corey. Serving on a Corey. Man. And just by dumb luck, I guess my daughter-in-law's seen that I favored out of the 3 ships. I favored the Corey. If I hardly ever talked about it. The Navy until I got old now and everything. Never talked about it. And she seen I favored the Corey and she bought me the Corey hat.
Letters were found from Tesh
And
offering not only to supply the gas
this past Veterans Day, I wore my Corey hat and I went into Tractor Supply.
not even realizing I'm wearing my goalie hat.
Testified that the
And a
directors of
young
the Tesh company
girl,
would not have helped knowing
woman walked up to me and said to me,
since they furnished enough to exterminate a couple of million people.
thanks for
A British military court was convinced
protecting
of
our
the
country.
trial of the two partners,
Huh.
Bruno Tesh and Karl
Who, me?
Heidegger, who were sentenced to death in
God.
1946 and hanged. The director of the second firm,
It made me proud.
Peters of Degesch of Dessau, got off more lightly. A German court sentenced him to 5 years imprisonment. Before the post-war trials in Germany, it had been generally believed that the mass killings were exclusively the work of a relatively few fanatical SS leaders. But the records of the courts leave no doubt of the complicity of a number of German businessmen, not only the groups and the directors of the IG Farben Chemical Trust, but smaller entrepreneurs who outwardly must have seemed to be the most prosaic and decent of men, pillars, like good businessmen everywhere, of their communities. How many hapless, innocent
Then there was
people,
one other
mostly
little
Jews, but
incident.
including a fairly large number of others,
I ran
especially
into a
Russian
video
prisoners
of
war, were slaughtered at the one camp
recent,
of
just
Auschwitz.
in YouTube
The exact number
recently,
will never be known.
right around that
Pierce himself in his affidavit
Veterans
gave an
Day.
estimate of
These two ships
2,500,000 victims executed and exterminated by
but bumped
gassing
into
and
each other
burning,
and damaged the
and at
ship.
least
And the
another
one,
500,000 who succumbed to starvation and disease.
it was the fault of one of the
making a
ships.
total of about
And
3
they,
million.
a young man and a young sailor
Later at his own trial
with his
in Warsaw, he
iPhone
reduced the figure
put
to
the
1,135,000.
video onto YouTube and
Soviet
badmouthed
government,
that
which investigated
other
the
ship
camp
that
after
the
it was
action
overrun
that
by
they
the Red
banged
Army in
into them. They
January
didn't know what the hell they're
1945,
doing and
put the figure at 4
everything.
million.
Worse than that, worse
On the
than that.
basis of his own exhaustive study, doubts that the number
And
cast at Auschwitz was even as high as
I thought,
3/4
what's
of
he
a million.
putting that on the
He estimates
internet?
600,000 died in the gas chambers, to which he adds the unknown proportion.
The following day was gone. I was in my time. They'd put you in front of a firing squad for crying out loud for doing something like that. Maybe I don't know, but they didn't fool around. You went before the captain. That's it. And my grandson mentioned to me, it's his iPhone. It's his iPhone? His. Take that goddamn iPhone and throw it in a creek. Are you nuts? The little in that ship, I forget the name of it, but at the time I recalled it. It was a famous warship, a famous destroyer.
516 German and Russian Jews executed at his prison during the 6-week period.
And he's going to, oh God almighty.
Some 336.
It had destroyed it, it had
The gold was melted down and shipped along with other
history
valuables snatched from the condemned Jews to the
with the
Reichsbank,
kamikaze
where
pilots, you
under
know.
a secret agreement between Himmler and the bank's president, Dr. Walter Funk, it was deposited to the credit of the SS in an account given the cover name of Max Heiliger. This prize booty from the extermination camps included, besides gold from dentures, gold watches, earrings, bracelets, rings, necklaces, and even spectacles frames. For the Jews had been encouraged to bring all their valuables with them for the promised resettlement. There were also great stocks of jewelry, especially diamonds and much silverware, and there were great wads of banknotes. The Reichsbank, in fact, was overwhelmed by the Max Heiliger deposits. With its vaults filled to overflowing as early as 1942, the bank's profit-minded directors sought to turn the holdings into cold cash by disposing of them through the municipal pawn shops. One letter from the Reichsbank to the Berlin Municipal Pawn Shop dated September 15th speaks of a second shipment and begins, "We submit to you the following valuables and the request for the best possible utilization." The list is long and itemized, and includes 154 gold watches, 1,601 gold earrings, 132 diamond rings, 784 silver pocket watches, and 160 diverse dentures, partly of gold. By the beginning of 1944, the Berlin pawn shop itself was overwhelmed by the flow of these stolen goods and informed the Reichsbank it could accept no more. When the Allies overran Germany, they discovered in some abandoned salt mines, where the Nazis had hidden part of their records and booty, enough left over from the Max Heiliger account to fill 3 huge vaults in the Frankfurt branch of the Reichsbank. Did the bankers know the sources of these unique deposits. The manager of the precious metals
Anyway,
department
I was
of the
proud of my
Reichsbank
time
promised
on the
Nuremberg that he and his associates
Corey
began to notice that
BB
many shipments came from
817,
Lublin and Auschwitz.
the Murray
We all knew that these places were the sites of
BBE
concentration camps.
576,
It was in the 10th delivery in
and the
November
Grand Canyon
1943 that dental
AD
gold
28.
appeared. The quantity of dental gold became unusually great.
The Navy was
At Nuremberg, the notorious
an experience. We'll call it an
Chief
experience.
of
I
the
ain't saying it
Economic
was
Office
good
of
to
the
me,
SS, who
but
handled the transactions for his
it
organization,
was good. It was
emphasized
good.
that Dr. Funk and the officials
Got a lot
and
of good
directors
things out of it. I got a lot of
very
bad
well
things out
the
of it.
origins of the goods they were trying to pawn.
That took me a while
He
to,
explained in some detail the business
for me to be
between
cured.
Funk and the SS concerning the delivery of valuables of
Before I went in, I
Jews
drank
to
a
the
little,
Reichsbank.
and then
He remembered
it
the conversation
escalated.
with the bank's vice president.
I wasn't floundering or nothing.
In this conversation, no doubt remained
didn't-
that the
I
objects
liked
to
to
be
drink.
delivered came from Jews who had been
I didn't
killed
think
in
I drank too
concentration
much.
camps.
I thought I drank just
The
enough,
objects in
just
question,
right.
Rings, watches, eyeglasses, gold
So
bars,
be it.
wedding rings, brooches,
That was the
pins,
Navy,
gold fillings, and other valuables.
and I'm proud of my time when I
Once,
served.
Cole related after an inspection tour through the vaults of the Reichsbank where the valuables from the dead Jews were inspected. Dr. Funk tendered the party a pleasant dinner, which the conversation turned around the
One other
unique
thing,
origins of the booty.
Uncle Steve's
Dr. Funk was sentenced
and
to
my Uncle Eddie's picture never made it. Maybe I'll do something another time or something, but they'll never be forgotten. Them and others like them who defended our country and help us win this thing. Terrible, terrible man. Take care. Okay. I chose Mozart. I'm sorry, Johann Strauss. Johann Strauss for the music. To cheer us up after that terrible thing we watched and witnessed. I would also highly recommend
This is Audible. Blackstone Audio presents The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. A history
you
of
can
Nazi
get it
Germany
from
by
Amazon.
William L. Shire.
Join Amazon, they'll read it to you.
Chapter 23. Barbarossa. The Turn of Russia.
Take care, my friend.